The compass lies in two pieces on the captain's table, not smashed, disassembled as if someone needed to understand how it worked in the 30 seconds before they stopped needing to know anything at all. In the galley, the stove has been wrenched from its mountings, and pots hang at angles that suggest the sea got inside. The ship's clock reads 8:03, both hands frozen, though whether morning or evening, no one will ever confirm. A child's shoe rests beside a sewing machine, and in the hold, 9 barrels have emptied themselves through pores in red oak, while 1,600 others wait intact behind white. The vessel carries 6 months of food, a fortune in industrial alcohol, and no one to deliver either. It has been sailing itself for 9 days across 400 miles of open Atlantic. Was this an act of terror or an act of clarity? The British brig Dei Gratia logged the sighting at 1 p.m. on December 4, 1872, though by sea time the date had already turned to the 5th. Captain David Morehouse watched the vessel through his glass for 2 hours before acknowledging what his helmsman had reported. The ship was not sailing, it was drifting, and its movements suggested no hand at the wheel. The distance closed to 6 miles. The sails were set wrong, some furled, others catching wind at angles that would have horrified any competent sailor. When Morehouse finally ordered a boat launched, his first mate, Oliver Deveau, took 2 men and rowed across water that had been killing ships for centuries. What they found was the Mary Celeste, an American brigantine Morehouse recognized from New York Harbor. She had left 8 days before his own departure, carrying a faster route and better winds. She should have been halfway to Genoa by now. Instead, she was here, 700 miles off course, executing a slow circle in the mid-Atlantic, with no one aboard to explain why. Deveau's report, later delivered under oath at Gibraltar, catalogued the disorder with the precision of a man who understood he was describing something that would be questioned for decades. 3.5 feet of water sloshed in the hold, not enough to sink her, but enough to suggest the pumps had stopped working or had never been started. One pump had been disassembled, its parts scattered, as if someone had been trying to diagnose a problem in the dark. The ship's single yawl, a small boat capable of holding 10 people if they didn't mind drowning together, was missing. So were the chronometer, the sextant, the navigation book, and the ship's register. The logbook remained, its last entry dated November 25th. The Mary Celeste had been 6 nautical miles from Santa Maria Island in the Azores. That was 9 days ago. The cargo was largely intact. 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, shipped by Meissner Ackerman and Commerce of New York, bound for Genoa to fortify wine. Industrial ethanol rendered poisonous with additives, methanol, benzene, other compounds designed to make it undrinkable. The manifest valued it at $35,000, worth perhaps $800,000 in modern terms. The freight charges alone were $3,400. The ship herself was insured for $14,000, though her owner, James Winchester, had paid $10,000 for her most recent refit earlier that year. These were not small sums. These were the kind of numbers that required men to make decisions about risk. In the captain's cabin, Deveau found a melodeon, a small pump organ, and a child's clothing laid out as if someone had been in the middle of dressing a 2-year-old when the dressing stopped. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their daughter, Sophia Matilda, on this voyage. Their 7-year-old son, Arthur, had stayed in Massachusetts with his grandmother to attend school. Briggs was 37 years old, from a seafaring family in Marion, Massachusetts. He did not drink. He read the Bible. He had hand-picked his crew. First mate, Albert Richardson, who was married to Winchester's niece. Second mate, Andrew Gilling from New York. 4 German sailors from the Frisian Islands. These were not the kind of men who mutinied. These were not the kind of men who abandoned a seaworthy ship unless something made staying aboard a worse proposition than the open Atlantic in a boat barely large enough to hold them all. The galley was in disarray. The stove had been knocked from its place. Cooking utensils were strewn about. The captain's bed was wet, unfit for sleeping. The whole ship was what the court record would later describe as a thoroughly wet mess, though that mess contained 6 months' worth of provisions: flour, water, salt pork, all the necessities of a transatlantic crossing. No one had stolen anything. No one had drunk the alcohol. The crew's belongings remained in their quarters, including their foul weather gear and their tobacco pipes. Sailors do not abandon pipes. That detail, more than any other, suggested the departure had been both urgent and expected to be temporary. Morehouse faced a decision that would be examined in a Gibraltar courtroom for 3 months. Under maritime law, a derelict, a vessel entirely deserted without hope of recovery, was fair game for salvage. The salvor who brought her to port could expect a substantial reward, typically a significant portion of the combined value of ship and cargo. But salvage required dividing his crew, leaving both vessels undermanned and vulnerable to the weather that had been punishing this stretch of ocean for a week. The Dei Gratia was carrying 1,735 barrels of petroleum. If a storm came, if something went wrong, he would lose both ships, both cargoes, and quite possibly both crews. He made the calculation that every captain makes, the risk against the reward. DeVoe would take the Mary Celeste with 2 men, Augustus Anderson and Charles Lund. They would sail her the 800 miles to Gibraltar. It took them 2 days to make her ready, pumping water, resetting sails, doing the small repairs that turn a drifting hulk back into a functional vessel. Then both ships departed, keeping each other in sight when weather permitted, proceeding toward the British territory where the laws of salvage would be administered by the Vice Admiralty Court. They arrived on December 12th and 13. The Mary Celeste docked on Friday the 13th. That detail, like so many others, would later be granted significance it did not deserve. What mattered was that a ship worth $49,000, cargo, vessel, and freight combined, had been delivered to port by 3 men who expected to be paid for their trouble. What mattered was that no one could explain where the 10 people who had sailed her from New York had gone, or why they had left behind everything a person would need to survive at sea except the one thing that would kill them fastest: a small boat in the open ocean with no supplies and no realistic chance of reaching land. The questions would begin in 4 days, when the salvage hearing opened. But the answers, if they existed, had already been lost somewhere between the Azores and the Portuguese coast, in water too deep for recovery and too cold for survival. Frederick Solly Flood did not believe in coincidence, and he certainly did not believe in ghost ships. The Attorney General of Gibraltar was also Advocate General and Proctor for the Queen in her Office of Admiralty, which meant that when a derelict vessel arrived in port with a salvage claim attached, it was his job to determine whether crime had occurred before commerce could proceed. He began the hearings on December 17, 1872, with the assumption that someone was lying. The suspicion was not irrational. The structure of maritime salvage created incentives for exactly the kind of fraud Solly Flood imagined. A ship abandoned at sea became worth more to the finder than to the owner, provided the finder could prove he had saved it from genuine peril. The Dei Gratia's crew stood to gain thousands of dollars, perhaps as much as a fifth of the combined value of the Mary Celeste and her cargo, which would be split among Captain Morehouse and the men who had sailed her to Gibraltar. That was years of wages for a common seaman. It was the kind of money that made men consider actions they would otherwise reject. Moreover, Morehouse and Briggs had sailed from New York within 8 days of each other, following roughly parallel courses across the Atlantic. Some accounts, much later, 50 years after the fact, when Morehouse's widow recalled it, suggested the 2 captains had dined together the night before the Mary Celeste's departure. Whether they were friends or merely acquaintances, they moved in the same circles of New York maritime commerce. They knew the same ship owners. They understood the same systems. And now one of them was missing, while the other had delivered his ship to port and filed a claim for salvage. The alternative explanation that 10 people had climbed into a yawl and vanished into the Atlantic for reasons no one could determine struck Solly Flood as precisely the kind of story a clever criminal would invent. It was unfalsifiable. It explained everything while proving nothing. And so he ordered a thorough examination of the Mary Celeste, looking for evidence that would convert mystery into prosecutable fact. On December 23rd, John Austin, the surveyor of shipping, went aboard with a diver named Ricardo Fortunato. They inspected every accessible surface, measuring, documenting, searching for signs of violence. They found cuts on the bow, deliberate, Austin believed, made to simulate damage from storm or collision. They found what appeared to be bloodstains on the captain's sword. They found an axe mark on one of the ship's rails. The inventory of suspicious details grew. Each one, examined individually, suggested foul play. Each one, considered in context, dissolved into ambiguity. The cuts on the bow could have been splinters from rough seas striking exposed wood. Wood grain can split in patterns that resemble tool marks, especially after prolonged exposure to salt water. The bloodstains on the sword, when subjected to chemical analysis available in 1872, turned out not to be blood at all, possibly rust, possibly residue from cutting fruit, possibly nothing more significant than the ordinary oxidation of metal stored in damp conditions. The axe mark could have been made during routine maintenance or cargo loading, or it could have been made during a panicked attempt to cut away damaged rigging, or it could have existed before the voyage began. One of 1,000 small wounds every working ship accumulates over years of service. Solly Flood was not interested in alternative explanations. The testimony of DeVoe and John Wright, the D.I. Gratia's second mate, convinced him that a crime had occurred, though he could not determine what crime or who had committed it or against whom. The New York Shipping and Commercial List picked up the thread on December 21st. The inference is that there has been foul play somewhere and that alcohol is at the bottom of it. The phrasing was careful. Alcohol as catalyst, not cargo. The suggestion being that the crew had drunk some of the industrial ethanol despite its poisonous additives, and in their intoxication had murdered the captain and his family before fleeing in the yawl. This theory required ignoring several facts. First, that Captain Briggs was known as a staunch abstainer who would not have permitted drinking aboard his vessel. Second, that the cargo was denatured alcohol, specifically formulated to cause violent illness or death if consumed. Third, that 9 barrels had leaked or emptied, all 9 made of red oak, which is porous and unsuitable for storing volatile liquids, while the 1,692 barrels made of white oak remained full. Fourth, that no evidence of drunkenness or violence appeared anywhere on the ship. Fifth, that if the crew had mutinied, they would have taken the ship, not abandoned it with all its valuable cargo intact. But facts were less important than procedure. The hearing dragged through December into January, then into February. Witnesses testified. Experts examined the vessel. Documents were submitted regarding the ship's ownership structure, insurance coverage, and cargo manifest. James Winchester, the majority shareholder who held 6 of the 12 shares, gave evidence that Captain Briggs was a courageous officer who would not desert his ship except to save his life. Winchester also noted that First Mate Albert Richardson was fit to command a vessel himself. These were not desperate men. These were not criminals. The problem was that the alternative explanation that something had frightened or convinced Briggs to abandon a seaworthy ship required accepting that an experienced captain had made a catastrophic error in judgment. It required believing that a man who had spent his life at sea, who came from a family of ship captains, who had successfully navigated multiple transatlantic crossings, had panicked over a situation that did not warrant panic. And while such errors certainly occurred, they typically left more evidence. They typically involved actual danger, fire, collision, storm damage, severe enough to threaten the hull. The Mary Celeste showed none of these signs. What she showed instead was water in the hold, a disassembled pump, missing navigation instruments, and a broken main halyard, a rope 3 inches in circumference, thick enough to withstand considerable strain, hanging over the side. That last detail emerged during the cross-examination of Augustus Anderson, one of the Dei Gratia seamen who had brought the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar. A halyard is used to raise and lower sails, but a halyard can also be used as a tether to keep a small boat attached to a larger ship, while the people in the small boat wait to see if the larger ship is about to explode or sink or do something else that would make remaining aboard a fatal decision. If that was what happened, if Briggs had ordered everyone into the yawl and tied it to the Mary Celeste while he assessed some perceived danger, then the broken halyard explained everything. A sudden wind catches the ship. The rope, already under strain from the weight of 10 people, and the boat, snaps. The Mary Celeste sails away, leaving the yawl and its occupants behind. They are perhaps 6 miles from Santa Maria Island, but 6 miles in a small boat in rough seas with no provisions is a distance that kills people. They would have had hours, perhaps a day if they were lucky. Then the Atlantic would have taken them. But this explanation, like all the others, rested on speculation. The halyard was broken. That was documented. Everything else was inference built on inference, possibilities stacked like cargo in a hold that was slowly taking on water. Solly Flood could not prove murder. He could not prove insurance fraud. He could not prove conspiracy between the crews of the 2 vessels. He had suspicion and he had irregularities, but he did not have evidence sufficient to detain anyone or deny the salvage claim outright. On February 25, 1873, he reluctantly released the Mary Celeste from the court's jurisdiction. 2 weeks later, with a locally hired crew under Captain George Blatchford, she sailed for Genoa to finally deliver her cargo of alcohol, 95 days late, but intact. The question of salvage payment was decided on April 8th. Chief Justice Sir James Cochrane announced the award. £1,700 sterling, approximately 8,300 American dollars. This was roughly 1/5 of the total value of ship and cargo. By contemporary standards, it was insultingly low. Salvage awards typically ranged from 1/3 to 1/2 of saved value when the operation involved significant risk and skill. The Dei Gratia's crew had sailed an undermanned, partially flooded vessel 800 miles through winter Atlantic weather. They had succeeded in bringing her safely to port. Under normal circumstances, they should have received twice or even 3 times what Cochrane awarded. The low payment was a message. The court suspected something, even if it could not prove what that something was. Cochrane's final comments were harshly critical of Morehouse for sending the Dei Gratia ahead to deliver her cargo of petroleum while remaining in Gibraltar himself, though this decision was entirely rational. Why keep a revenue-generating vessel idle during a months-long hearing when the captain could remain to testify while the ship conducted its business? The men who had risked their lives and split their crew to bring a valuable ship to port walked away with far less than they deserved, their reputations tainted by suspicion that would never be conclusively disproven or conclusively confirmed. The Mary Celeste sailed on to Genoa, and somewhere in the Atlantic, if the halyard theory was correct, 10 bodies had long since stopped floating. The Mary Celeste delivered her cargo to Genoa in March 1873 and immediately became a vessel no one wanted to own for long. Winchester retained his majority share, but the ship cycled through captains and minor investors with the frequency of a boarding house during epidemic season. This was not unusual for merchant vessels of the era. Ownership structures shifted constantly as men bought in hoping for profit and sold out when those profits failed to materialize. What was unusual was the speed with which the Mary Celeste burned through these arrangements and the consistency with which she failed to generate returns that would justify her continued operation. The problem was not her seaworthiness. The Dei Gratia crew had sailed her 800 miles undermanned, and she had performed adequately. The problem was not her cargo capacity. The 1872 refit had increased her tonnage to 282.28, making her suitable for profitable transatlantic runs. The problem was that ships, like people, acquire reputations, and reputations affect the willingness of others to invest time, money, or life in their continued existence. The Mary Celeste had become famous, and fame in maritime circles was rarely an asset. Sailors are superstitious in proportion to their understanding of how little control they have over outcomes. The sea kills without motive or pattern, which means humans impose patterns to create the illusion of predictability. A ship where 10 people vanished became, by this logic, a ship where more people might vanish. Whether this was rational did not matter. What mattered was that captains found it harder to recruit crew, that insurance underwriters charged higher premiums, that cargo shippers preferred vessels without mysterious disappearances attached to their history. The Mary Celeste was not cursed. She was simply carrying a cost that could not be itemized on any ledger, the cost of being the wrong kind of famous. The ship sailed for the next 12 years, mostly to the West Indies and Indian Ocean. The routes were longer and less profitable than the transatlantic runs she had been designed for. The cargoes were bulk goods with thin margins, sugar, molasses, timber, items that paid by volume but offered little profit per ton. Records of her voyages during this period are sparse, which likely means they were unremarkable. Ships generated documentation when they made money, or when they lost money in interesting ways, or when they needed repairs that required explaining to creditors. The Mary Celeste appears to have done none of these things consistently enough to warrant attention. In February 1879, she was at St. Helena Island. Her captain, Edgar Toothill, had fallen ill and required medical assistance. He died on the island, becoming the third captain to die while in command of the vessel, if one counts Robert McClellan, who had died during her maiden voyage in 1861 when she was still named Amazon, and John Nutting Parker, who had survived his term but whose fate afterward is unrecorded. 3 dead captains in 18 years of service. Again, not unusual by the standards of 19th century maritime commerce, where illness, accident, and violence were occupational hazards. But the number accumulated meaning through repetition. The ship that took 10 people and gave back nothing was now the ship that killed her captains. The narrative wrote itself. By February 1880, Winchester and his partners had had enough. They sold the Mary Celeste to a Boston group led by Wesley Gove. A new captain, Thomas Fleming, took command and held it until August 1884. Then Gilman C. Parker replaced him. The ship's home port changed several times during these years, eventually returning to Boston. There are no records of specific voyages, no manifest documents, no insurance claims, nothing that would indicate how she was being used or whether she was generating revenue. One historian suggests Gove tried hard to make her successful, which is another way of saying he failed, but put effort into the failure. Ships are capital goods. They depreciate, timber rots, iron corrodes, sails tear, rigging frays. A vessel requires constant maintenance to remain viable, and maintenance requires cash flow. If the ship earns enough to cover her upkeep plus a margin, she continues operating. If she does not, she either gets sold to someone willing to subsidize her operation, or she gets sailed until she falls apart, or she gets deliberately destroyed in a way that transfers her paper value, the insured value, to someone who can convert that paper into actual money. By late 1884, the Mary Celeste had reached the end of her commercial viability. She was 23 years old. She had survived multiple groundings, collisions, and at least one instance of being abandoned at sea. Her hull was worn, her reputation toxic, her earning potential exhausted. She was worth more destroyed than operational, which made her destruction inevitable. The only question was how obvious the destruction would be, and whether anyone would face consequences for it. Captain Gilman Parker answered both questions. In November 1884, he conspired with a group of Boston shippers to load the Mary Celeste with cargo that was valuable on paper and worthless in fact. The manifest listed goods worth $30,000. The actual cargo consisted largely of cat food, rubber boots, barrels of cheap ale, and other refuse that might charitably be described as mixed merchandise. Parker insured this cargo for its manifest value, which in modern terms would be approximately $1 million. Then he sailed from Boston to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, with the intention of converting the insured value into cash by means of a well-charted coral reef. The plan was not sophisticated. On January 3, 1885, Parker sailed the Mary Celeste directly onto Rocheleau Bank, a large reef in the channel between Gonave Island and the Haitian mainland. The reef was marked on every chart. Every captain sailing through that channel knew its location. Parker ran the ship onto it deliberately, ripping out her bottom and wrecking her beyond any possibility of repair. Then he and his crew rowed ashore. Parker sold the salvageable cargo to the American consul for $500, pocketed the money, and filed an insurance claim for $30,000 for the cargo plus whatever the hull was insured for. The American consul, upon examining what Parker had sold him, realized immediately that it was garbage. He reported this to the insurance companies, who began an investigation that quickly revealed the entirety of Parker's scheme. The cargo manifest was fraudulent. The ship had been deliberately wrecked. The insurance claim was an attempt to steal $30,000 from underwriters who had insured the voyage in good faith. Parker and his co-conspirators were arrested and brought to trial in Boston in July 1885. The charges were conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and barratry, the willful destruction of a ship by its master. Barratry, at the time, carried the death penalty. The legal system would have been entirely within its rights to hang Parker from a gibbet as an example to other captains who might consider similar schemes. The conspiracy trial went to the jury first. On August 15th, they announced they could not agree on a verdict. Some jurors were unwilling to convict on the conspiracy charge, while the capital charge of barratry was still pending. They did not want to prejudice Parker's chances in a trial where his life was at stake. Rather than order a retrial, which would have been expensive and time-consuming, the judge negotiated an arrangement. The defendants would withdraw their insurance claims and repay all money they had received. In exchange, the barratry charge would be deferred. Parker was allowed to go free. Free is a relative term. His professional reputation was destroyed. No shipping company would hire him. No insurance company would cover any vessel he commanded. No crew would sail under a captain known to have wrecked his own ship for money. He died in poverty 3 months later. One of his co-defendants went insane. Another committed himself. The Mary Celeste, or what remained of her, lay on Rocheleau Reef off the coast of Haiti, her timbers slowly being consumed by shipworms and weather. Her story finished in a way that was pathetic rather than mysterious. Except her story was not finished, because stories are not controlled by the objects they describe. The Mary Celeste that wrecked in 1885 was a rotting hulk worth nothing. The Mary Celeste that had been found abandoned in 1872 was worth everything, because she represented an unsolved question, and unsolved questions have no depreciation schedule. While the physical ship was being ground to splinters by Caribbean storms, the narrative ship was being reconstructed in newspapers, magazines, and eventually books and films. The version that would be remembered was not the one that died in an insurance fraud, but the one that sailed on forever, empty and perfect, through an Atlantic that existed only in imagination. Snow melts at different rates depending on depth, sunlight exposure, water flow beneath. By early May, the search had officially concluded. 5 bodies had been found in February and March, all attributed to hypothermia, except for Rustem Slobodin's minor skull fracture. The case file documented the tent, the footprints, the cedar tree, the return attempts. The Soviet prosecutor's office in Sverdlovsk prepared to close the investigation. The phrase, "compelling natural force," had already been written into draft reports. Then, on May 4th, a Mansi hunter discovered something in a ravine 75 meters deeper into the forest from the cedar tree. The bodies had been there the entire time, buried under 4 meters of snow in a small creek bed where water ran beneath ice, where seasonal melt accumulated, where probes had been thrust in February but hadn't reached deep enough. The snow had finally receded. What emerged was not hypothermia. What emerged required forensic expert Boris Vozrojdeny to recalibrate every assumption about the incident. 4 bodies: Ludmila Dubinina, 20, Semyon Zolotaryov, 37, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 23, Alexander Kolovatov, 24. They were positioned close together in a space measuring roughly 4 square meters. Near them lay the remains of a makeshift shelter, a den constructed from cedar branches, 14 fir tree tops, and 1 birch top, cut with a knife, laid tightly together to form a platform approximately 2 by 1.5 meters, thick enough to insulate bodies from direct contact with snow. The branches had been gathered from trees 15 meters away toward the forest. Clothing had been placed on top of the branches for additional warmth: fragments of ski pants, torn sweaters, a brown woolen pullover. The construction showed intent, planning, survival instinct. It showed people who understood what hypothermia required and had taken methodical steps to prevent it. Then the autopsies revealed what separated these 4 from the others. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, major skull fracture with bone fragments driven into his brain. Cause of death: traumatic brain injury, though he had survived long enough after the injury to move to the ravine. Lyudmila Dubinina, bilateral rib fractures, ribs 2 through 7 on the right side, ribs 2 through 6 on the left, symmetrical, compressive, hemorrhaging into the cardiac muscle, blood in the pleural cavity indicating she had been alive when injured. Cause of death: internal bleeding and shock from chest trauma. Semyon Zolotaryov, unilateral rib fractures, ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the right side. Hemorrhaging into the right atrium of the heart. Similar pattern of injury to Dubinina, but asymmetrical, suggesting the force came from a slightly different angle, or the bodies were positioned differently when struck. Cause of death: internal bleeding and shock from chest trauma. Alexander Kolovatov, minor injuries consistent with hypothermia. No major trauma. Cause of death: hypothermia. Vozrojdeny compared the force required to inflict Dubinina's and Zolotaryov's injuries to being struck by a car traveling at high speed. The ribs had fractured inward, crushing organs, yet there were no corresponding external wounds, no bruises, no lacerations, no surface trauma that would indicate blunt impact from a fist, a fall, a weapon. The skin was intact. The damage was entirely internal. Medical literature documents this pattern in cases of extreme compression, industrial accidents where bodies are caught between heavy machinery, car crashes where seat belts restrain the torso during sudden deceleration, avalanches where the weight of snow exerts massive pressure uniformly across the body. Dubinina's injuries extended beyond the ribs. Her tongue was missing, her eyes were absent. Part of her lips and facial tissue were gone. A fragment of her skull had separated. Zolotaryov's eyes were also missing. Kolovatov had lost his eyebrows. The 1959 investigation attributed these losses to decomposition and scavenging. The bodies had lain in a stream for 3 months. Water accelerates tissue breakdown, particularly soft tissues like eyes, tongues, lips, areas rich in moisture, accessible to insects, vulnerable to microbial activity, even in freezing conditions where liquid water flows beneath ice. Modern forensic pathologists who have reviewed the case files note that missing soft tissue is expected in bodies submerged or partially submerged for extended periods, especially in environments where carrion feeders, birds, rodents, insects, can access remains once snow begins to melt. This explanation is grounded in documented biological processes. But it does not explain the rib fractures. It does not explain Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture. It does not explain why 3 of the 4 bodies in the ravine suffered injuries comparable to car crashes, while Kolevatov, found in the same location, died of hypothermia with only minor trauma. The den itself presents a paradox. The platform of branches was well constructed, approximately 20 to 30 centimeters thick, designed to create an air cushion for thermal insulation, a standard technique in winter survival. Clothing from the bodies found earlier by the cedar had been brought to the ravine. Dubinina wore Krivonishchenko's torn and burned trousers wrapped around her left foot and shin. Zolotaryov wore Dubinina's hat and coat, though this detail is disputed in some accounts. Fragments of a beige sweater were found 15 meters from the den. Half of a pair of ski pants were discovered where branches had been cut. The clothing had been removed from the dead and repurposed by the living. A rational decision, documented in survival manuals, practiced by soldiers on the Eastern Front during the World War II, where Zolotaryov had served. The hikers were not irrational. They were executing survival protocol. Yet they were found only feet from their improvised shelter in the deep part of the Io ravine, clustered in 4 square meters. Dubinina was on her knees, face and chest pressed against a rock. Kolevatov and Zolotaryov were embraced, breast to back, as if Kolevatov had been trying to warm or protect Zolotaryov. The positions suggested final moments of care, of effort, of human connection in the face of systems, biological, physical, environmental, that do not negotiate. Then there was the radiation. Clothing samples from Dubinina and Kolevatov tested positive for beta particle contamination. The measurements varied. Some items registered up to 5,000 decays per minute, far above background radiation, but below levels that would cause acute radiation sickness. The contamination was not uniform. Certain areas of fabric showed elevated readings, while adjacent areas did not. The 1959 investigation noted this, but offered no definitive explanation. Later researchers pointed to the Kishtim disaster of 1957, a plutonium production accident at the Mayak nuclear facility, approximately 100 kilometers from Sverdlovsk. The disaster had contaminated a large area. One of the hikers had lived in the contamination zone. Another had participated in cleanup efforts. Radioactive particles could have adhered to clothing during those activities, remaining detectable years later. This explanation is plausible, documented, consistent with what is known about radioactive contamination persistence. But it does not explain why only 2 of the 9 hikers' clothing tested positive. It does not explain the concentration patterns. It introduces a variable, radiation, into a case already saturated with variables, and it does so without resolving the central question: what force caused the injuries in the ravine? The knife that cut the branches for the den was never found. Searchers recovered a bakelite sheath 18 centimeters long near the tent site, presumably belonging to Kolevatov. 3 prosecutors handled the case, and nobody agrees who was actually in charge. The criminal investigation began on February 26, 1959, opened by Vasily Ivanovich Tempelov, prosecutor for the town of Ivdel. He signed the initial case documents, conducted the first inspections of the scene, interrogated witnesses. Then, without documented transfer orders, Lev Nikitich Ivanov, a prosecutor criminalist from the regional prosecutor's office in Sverdlovsk, arrived and began running parallel operations. On May 28, 1959, Ivanov signed the order to close the case. His signature, his authority. But the investigative files show Tempelov still conducting site inspections as late as May 6, 22 days before closure. Vladimir Ivanovich Korotayev, the first investigator assigned to the case before Ivanov's arrival, was abruptly removed from the investigation after initial work interrogating Mansi hunters and pursuing hurricane theories. He would later recall details that contradicted the official record: KGB guards at the morgue, coroners working in barrels of alcohol, documents disappearing from case files. The paperwork does not clarify jurisdiction. Soviet criminal procedure required formal transfer orders when cases moved between prosecutors' offices. No such order exists in the files. Ivanov simultaneously led the investigation and conducted supervisory oversight, a procedural impossibility under Soviet law, where the supervisor cannot also be the investigator. Legal analysts who examined the case in 2018 noted this as one of multiple violations of criminal procedure standards, though they concluded the violations were typical for the period, not evidence of conspiracy. Other criminal cases from 1958-1960 showed similar deficiencies: missing signatures, handwritten autopsy reports on notebook paper, unsigned forensic examination orders, material evidence not properly attached to files. But the Dyatlov case had additional peculiarities. Autopsy reports dated May 9, 1959, were typed on the same typewriter as Ivanov's resolution to close the case, a typewriter located in the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office, not at the Sverdlovsk Regional Bureau of Forensic Examination, where medical examiner Boris Vozrojdeny worked. Forensic expert Henrietta Cherkina's examination of the tent cuts used imprecise measurements, no standardized methods, schematic drawings that simplified what witnesses described as multiple complex slashes. Some researchers, including former forensic expert Ankudinov, claim the autopsy reports in the files are not the original documents written by Vozrojdeny. The medical terminology contains errors, typos, phrasing inconsistent with a trained pathologist. These are disputed claims. The official case files remain. The signatures remain. The closure order remains. What is not disputed is the timeline. 3 months from case opening to case closure, covering an incident that killed 9 people under circumstances forensic. Examiners called unprecedented. On May 28, 1959, Ivanov wrote, "The reason for the death of the students was overwhelming force which they were unable to overcome." The phrase became infamous. Overwhelming force is not a forensic category. It is not a legal term. It is bureaucratic evasion elevated to official conclusion. The phrase allowed the case to close without identifying a perpetrator, a crime, a specific cause. Article 4, Paragraph 5 of the Code of Criminal Procedure of the RSFSR permitted case closure when no crime had been committed, when death resulted from accident, natural disaster, or circumstances beyond human control. Ivanov invoked this clause. He cited no specific natural force. He offered no mechanism. He documented the facts: tent slashed from inside, orderly footprints, bodies at various distances, injuries inconsistent with violence or predation, and then concluded that something overwhelming and unspecified had killed them all. Years later, in 1990, Ivanov would publish an article admitting his investigative team had no rational explanation for the incident. He stated that after reporting sightings of flying spheres, he received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to dismiss these claims. The spheres, orange lights seen by multiple witness groups in the area during January and February 1959, were documented in testimonies but excluded from the final report. Whether Ivanov genuinely believed in an anomalous explanation or whether he used the article to deflect responsibility for an incomplete investigation remains unclear. What is clear is that his 1990 admission contradicted his 1959 conclusion, replacing bureaucratic vagueness with speculative specificity. Evgeny Okishev, Ivanov's boss and deputy head of the investigative department of the Sverdlovsk Oblast Prosecution Office, gave interviews decades later suggesting he knew more than the case files revealed. He stated that orders came from above, from Ivan Urakov, deputy prosecutor of the RSFSR, sent by the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers to oversee the investigation. Okishev hinted that the deaths were full of secrets, that the investigation was constrained by non-disclosure agreements, that the official explanation was predetermined. He remained faithful to secrecy until his death, but his statements, vague, suggestive, never specific, fed theories that the Soviet state had reasons to suppress information. The non-disclosure agreements were real. Everyone who participated in the search signed documents binding them to silence for 25 years. This was standard procedure for incidents involving potential state security concerns, but it was not standard for hiking accidents caused by natural forces. Kholat-Syakhl and Mount Torton were closed to tourists after the incident, a restriction that lasted for years. The case files were sent to a secret archive. Photographs from Krivonischenko's camera, negatives showing the final images taken before the group's death, were kept in Ivanov's private archive for decades, only donated to the Dyatlov Foundation in 1997 by his daughter after his death. The investigation's procedural failures are documented. The interrogations, autopsies, scene inspections, evidence collection, each step shows gaps, inconsistencies, deviations from standard practice. Whether these failures resulted from incompetence, time pressure, resource limitations, or deliberate obfuscation cannot be determined from the files alone. Soviet bureaucracy in 1959 operated under constraints Western investigators did not face. Limited forensic technology, ideological pressure to avoid outcomes that embarrass the state, hierarchical command structures where orders from Moscow overrode local autonomy. What the investigation did establish: 9 experienced hikers died on or around February 1st to 2, 1959, on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl. 6 died of hypothermia. 3 died of severe internal injuries with no external wounds. The tent was cut from inside. Footprints led downslope in an orderly manner. Clothing was redistributed among survivors. A fire was built. A shelter was constructed. Then everyone died. What the investigation did not establish: what caused them to leave the tent? What caused the internal injuries? Why the tent was pitched on an exposed slope? Whether the group encountered other people? Whether military or scientific activities were occurring in the area? Whether the radiation found on clothing was relevant? Whether the missing soft tissue resulted from decomposition or from something else? The system documented everything except the answer. The case closed with a phrase that meant nothing and everything. Overwhelming force became the placeholder for certainty, the bureaucratic acknowledgement that some events exceed the capacity of investigation to resolve. The families received bodies, funerals, official condolences. They did not receive explanations. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, limiting the scope to 3 possible natural explanations: avalanche, slab avalanche, or hurricane. Murder was excluded before the investigation began. On July 11, 2020, Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the Urals Federal District Directorate of the Prosecutor General's Office, announced avalanche as the official cause. The 2020 conclusion replaced the 1959 conclusion, trading one certainty for another, though neither addressed all the evidence, and both left questions unresolved. The mountain does not care which prosecutor signs which document. It does not care about jurisdiction disputes, procedural violations, non-disclosure agreements, or bureaucratic phrases. It simply exists, accumulating snow, eroding under wind, indifferent to the systems humans construct to make sense. Every answer creates a diagram where some facts fit and others refuse. In 2013, American author Donnie Eichar published Dead Mountain, proposing that a Kármán vortex street, a weather phenomenon where wind hitting a dome-shaped peak creates rotating air patterns, generated infrasound that induced panic in the sleeping hikers. The theory drew on aerodynamic principles and studies showing that sound waves below 20 Hz can cause anxiety, nausea, breathing difficulty. French scientist Vladimir Gavreau had documented these effects in the 1960s after lab assistants developed unexplained symptoms traced to a malfunctioning fan producing low-frequency vibrations. A 2003 UK study found that 20% of people exposed to infrasound reported feeling scared or unable to breathe properly. Eichar's hypothesis positioned the tent directly downwind from Kholat-Syakhl's summit, far enough that wind vortices wouldn't physically damage the shelter, but close enough for infrasound to penetrate. The hikers would have felt an overwhelming sense of dread without understanding why. A freight train roar in the darkness, invisible pressure on their chests, a compulsion to flee that overrode rational thought. By the time they reached the forest and escaped the infrasound zone, they would have regained composure but been unable to navigate back in darkness and blizzard conditions. The theory explains the orderly evacuation, the lack of visible threat, the decision to leave without boots. It does not explain the internal injuries, Dubonina's bilateral rib fractures, Zolotaryov's chest trauma, Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture. Infrasound causes discomfort, not bone damage comparable to car crashes. Critics note that acoustic scientists remain uncertain whether infrasound exposure causes even mild symptoms, let alone panic severe enough to drive experienced mountaineers into lethal conditions. Kholat-Syakhl's dome is not unique. Similar topography exists throughout the Urals, yet hikers camp on such slopes without fleeing into the night. The number of people known to have died from infrasound exposure remains 0. In 2020, Russian authorities concluded that an avalanche was the official cause. Deputy Prosecutor Andrei Kuryakov stated the hikers' actions were textbook survival responses: emergency evacuation to safe ground, shelter in the forest, fire building, snow cave construction. The 2020 report emphasized heroism, not panic, a narrative shift from the 1959 investigation's vague, compelling natural force. But the 2020 investigation excluded murder before it began, limiting scope to 3 natural explanations: avalanche, slab avalanche, or hurricane. The predetermined boundaries meant certain questions could not be asked, certain evidence could not be re-examined with fresh forensic methods. Then, in 2021, Swiss scientists Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin published computer simulations demonstrating that a slab avalanche could occur on Kholat-Syakhl slope despite the angle being lower than the typical 30-degree minimum. Their model showed that the hikers' decision to cut a platform into the snow, standard practice for wind protection, destabilized the slope. Katabatic winds, dense cold air rushing downhill at high speeds, accumulated additional snow above the tent over several hours. Around midnight, the accumulated weight triggered a delayed slab release, a block of compacted snow sliding downward, striking the tent with force sufficient to cause the chest and skull injuries documented in autopsy reports. The simulation used Disney's frozen animation code for snow physics and General Motors cadaver test data from the 1970s to model impact forces on human bodies. The results matched the injury patterns: bilateral rib fractures from symmetrical compression, skull fractures from localized impact, internal bleeding without external wounds. The avalanche would have been small, covering only the tent area, explaining why searchers found no obvious debris field. Wind in subsequent weeks would have blown loose snow away, leaving the tent partially exposed with no visible avalanche traces. Gaume and Puzrin led 3 expeditions to Dyatlov Pass between 2021 and 2022, documenting slab avalanches in the area under similar weather conditions. On January 28, 2022, exactly 63 years after the group was last seen alive, 2 mountain guides reached the pass during deteriorating weather. Wind gusts overturned their 300-kilogram snowmobiles multiple times. Visibility dropped to near zero. Then, briefly, the weather cleared, revealing traces of 2 fresh slab avalanches on slopes near where the tent had been pitched. The 2021 study addresses 4 main objections to the avalanche theory. First, the lack of visible avalanche traces. Small slab avalanches on gentle slopes leave minimal debris, easily dispersed by wind. Second, the 9-hour delay between cutting the platform and the avalanche. The model shows that katabatic winds needed time to accumulate snow above the cut, gradually increasing load until a critical threshold triggered release. Third, the shallow slope. Digital elevation models revealed the terrain included sections exceeding 28 degrees, with steeper areas above 30 degrees, sufficient for slab formation. Fourth, the atypical injuries. Simulations proved that heavy blocks of snow striking sleeping people in confined spaces could cause crushing injuries without burying them under massive snow piles. Critics remain unconvinced. Photographs from February 1959 show orderly footprints leading downslope, not the chaotic scatter of people fleeing an avalanche. The injured, Dubonina with crushed ribs, Thibaut Brignol with a caved-in skull, would have been unconscious or immobile, yet their bodies were found 1.5 kilometers from the tent, down in the ravine where the shelter was constructed. How did incapacitated people travel that distance? Vozrojdeny estimated the ravine victims survived only 20-30 minutes after sustaining their injuries. The timeline doesn't accommodate a slow, careful descent while carrying the dying. Dr. Vladimir Borzenkov, who conducted winter expeditions to the pass in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2019, argues that while slab avalanches can occur in the region, no evidence suggests one struck the tent. He analyzed snow conditions, slope angles, weather patterns, and concluded the 1959 incident did not involve an avalanche. The case files, he notes, show searchers walking through the alleged avalanche path without disturbing debris because there was none. The tent's condition, partially collapsed but intact, with gear neatly arranged inside, does not match what avalanche-struck shelters look like. The radiation remains unexplained by any theory. Whether introduced during Krivonischenko's work at the Mayak nuclear facility, contaminated during cleanup operations after the 1957 Kishtim disaster, or originating from some other source, the presence of beta particle contamination on specific clothing items introduces a variable that does not resolve under avalanche models, infrasound models, or any other natural force hypothesis. It is a fact that exists alongside other facts, declining to fit narratives. Some theories propose military involvement, rocket tests, weapons experiments, parachute mines. These theories cite the orange spheres witnessed by other groups in the area during January-February 1959, reported by independent witnesses, including meteorological services and military observers. Prosecutor Ivanov mentioned these sightings in testimonies, but excluded them from the final 1959 report. In 1990, he admitted orders came from high-ranking officials to dismiss the sphere reports. Whether the spheres were aircraft, missile tests, atmospheric phenomena, or optical illusions caused by exhaustion and cold remains unverified. Military activity was common in the Urals. The region housed weapons facilities, test ranges, restricted zones. But no documents have surfaced linking specific operations to the night of February 1, 1959. Other theories invoke human conflict, encounters with escaped prisoners from the Ivdel labor camps, confrontations with Mansi hunters, infighting within the group. These theories rely on the absence of evidence as evidence, the sealed case files, the non-disclosure agreements, the KGB presence at the morgue, reported by investigator Korotayev decades later. The problem is, the wreckage on Rocheleau Reef lies in water shallow enough that sunlight reaches the bottom. The coral has consumed most of what was wood. What metal remains has oxidized into shapes that could be from any ship wrecked in that location over the past 200 years. There is no nameplate, no identifying feature, nothing that would allow a diver to surface and declare with certainty, "This is the Mary Celeste." There is only scattered debris that might be from the ship destroyed by Captain Parker in 1885, or might be from one of the dozens of other vessels that have struck the same reef over the centuries, meeting the same end in the same shallow water. This is appropriate. The physical Mary Celeste ceased to matter long before Parker wrecked her. By 1885, she was a worn-out brigantine worth less than the paper her insurance was written on. Her destruction was economically rational, the only way to extract value from something that had become a liability. But the narrative Mary Celeste had already diverged from the physical one, and that divergence is what preserved her. The ship that rotted on a reef for 140 years is gone. The ship that sails through cultural memory is indestructible because it was never made of timber. The 10 people who left the Mary Celeste on or around November 25, 1872, are gone in a different way. They entered the Atlantic and were subtracted from the world so completely that their absence became their defining characteristic. Benjamin Spooner Briggs, respected captain, devout Christian, family man. Sarah Briggs, who wrote to her mother-in-law about how much she would depend on letters from her son Arthur. Sophia Matilda Briggs, 2 years old. Albert Richardson, first mate, married to Winchester's niece. Andrew Gilling, second mate. Volkert and Boz Lorenzen, brothers from the Frisian Islands who had lost their possessions in a previous shipwreck and whose missing belongings on the Mary Celeste led investigators to suspect them of crimes they did not commit. Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gautschall, Edward Head, the steward, 7 crew members whose names appear in testimony, and then nowhere else. They became the mystery, but they were not mysterious. They were men and a woman and a child who worked within the same systems of maritime commerce that employed thousands of others. They signed contracts, collected wages, loaded cargo, navigated by instruments that were accurate to within a certain margin of error. They operated machinery that required maintenance. They made decisions based on available information, and when information was incomplete or incorrect, they made decisions anyway, because ships do not wait for certainty before requiring action. What happened to them cannot be separated from what the Mary Celeste was, a capital asset in a system that valued ships according to their ability to generate revenue. She was built to move cargo profitably. She succeeded for a while. She failed for a while longer. Eventually, she was destroyed because her continued existence was financially untenable. The crew's disappearance was the incident that made her famous, but it was not the reason she ultimately sank. She sank because Parker needed her to, because the money she represented on paper could only be extracted by converting her into a loss. This is the system the Mary Celeste reveals. Ships were insured not because anyone expected them to sink, but because enough of them sank that insurance was necessary. Salvage law existed not because derelicts were common, but because the ocean was large enough that ships did encounter each other in distress, and the law needed to create incentives for rescue that outweighed the risks. Ownership was divided into shares, not because doing so was efficient, but because ships were expensive and risk needed to be distributed. Captains invested their life savings in partial ownership not because they were entrepreneurs, but because wages alone would never provide financial security. Every decision documented in the Mary Celeste story, from Winchester's $10,000 refit to Briggs's choice to bring his family on the voyage to Morehouse's calculation about whether to salvage the derelict to Parker's insurance fraud, can be understood as responses to the economic pressures inherent in 19th century maritime commerce. These were not evil men making evil choices. They were men making the choices available to them within structures that limited their options and punished failure. The Gibraltar hearing was not interested in systems. It was interested in identifying criminals. Solly Flood needed someone to blame because maritime law was built on the assumption that disasters were caused by human malfeasance, not by the inherent dangers of sending wooden boxes filled with flammable cargo across thousands of miles of hostile ocean using instruments that could be off by 100 miles and navigation techniques that relied on seeing stars that might be obscured by clouds for days at a time. The hearing failed because there was no crime to discover. There was only a ship that had been abandoned and 10 people who had died, and neither of those facts required a criminal to explain them. Modern investigations using weather databases and chemistry experiments have provided plausible explanations for why the abandonment occurred. These explanations are satisfying to people who value evidence-based reasoning. They are unsatisfying to people who need the Mary Celeste to represent something larger than a chain of mechanical and navigational failures. The ship has been deployed over 150 years as evidence for almost every theory about why things disappear: supernatural intervention, alien abduction, time anomalies, sea monsters, piracy, insurance fraud, conspiracy. Each theory says more about the person proposing it than about the ship itself. What the ship actually demonstrates is simpler and less interesting: that the ocean is dangerous, that 19th century maritime technology was inadequate to eliminate that danger, and that the economic system that sent ships across the Atlantic prioritized cargo delivery over crew safety because that was the system's function. 10 people died not because anything supernatural occurred, but because a series of mundane failures, leaking barrels, a faulty instrument, a broken rope, aligned in a way that left no survivors to explain the alignment. The Mary Celeste is called a mystery because the specific sequence of those failures was not documented. But calling it a mystery obscures what it actually reveals: that maritime commerce in the 1870s killed people regularly, that most of those deaths were never explained in detail, and that the Mary Celeste is exceptional only because the ship survived when the people did not. Thousands of ships sank completely, taking their crews with them, leaving no evidence and generating no mysteries. The Mary Celeste generates mystery because she provided evidence without explanation, the worst possible combination for anyone seeking narrative closure. What remains is this: a ship was built, sailed, found abandoned, adjudicated in court, returned to service, and eventually destroyed in a fraud. 10 people boarded that ship, left it for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, and died before reaching safety. These are facts. Everything else, the vapor explosions, the false soundings, the broken halyards, the theories about what Briggs was thinking in the moment before he ordered abandonment, is reconstruction built on evidence that is simultaneously too much and too little. Too much because the ship's survival provided details that demand explanation. Too little because none of those details definitively establish why the departure occurred. The ocean gave back a ship and kept 10 people. This asymmetry is what makes the story durable. If both had been lost, there would be no story, just another entry in the maritime casualty lists that documented the routine violence of 19th century shipping. If both had been saved, there would be a story with a definitive ending, which would drain it of the ambiguity that allows continued speculation. Instead, we have the worst combination for the people involved, and the best combination for the people who retell their story. An outcome that is catastrophic but incomplete, fatal but unexplained, documented but unknowable. The Mary Celeste remains on Rocheleau Reef, probably in pieces too small to identify with certainty. The 10 people remain somewhere in the Atlantic, in the form of atoms that have long since been distributed through the food chain and the water cycle to become parts of other organisms. The story remains in books and documentaries and articles like this one, being retold because each generation needs its own version of the question: what makes people vanish? The answer, in the case of the Mary Celeste, is probably mundane. The question persists because mundane answers to extraordinary outcomes feel insufficient, and humans would rather have an insufficient mystery than an insufficient explanation that robs the event of its narrative power. The ship sails on, not through water, but through the gap between what we can document and what we can understand. That gap will never close. The Mary Celeste will never be solved in the sense that would silence all speculation, because the speculation is the point. The mystery is what survives when everything else has rotted away.